Timeline of notable harms done in the name of science. Concise entries, FOT+ sources. 19th century, early chemical and medical harms, mercury, arsenic, and other toxic remedies, 1800s, early 1900s. Mercury and arsenic compounds were widely used in medicines, e.g., for syphilis, causing poisoning and chronic health problems in patients. Asbestos begins widespread industrial use, late 1800s onward, used for insulation and construction. Decades later, linked to mesothelioma and other fatal diseases among workers and communities. Industrial Occupational History, CWHO, on asbestos risks. Early 20th century, eugenics, sterilization, and unethical human experimentation. Eugenics and forced sterilizations, early 1900s, mid-1900s. State-led sterilization programs targeted marginalized groups in multiple countries, US, Sweden, Canada, Germany, causing lifelong harm and population-level abuses. Prisoner, psychiatric patient, and colonial experiments. Vulnerable populations were used in experiments without consent, nutrition experiments, sterilization, infectious disease studies. 1930s, 1970s, medical abuses and unethical studies. Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932-1972, U.S. Public Health Service studied the untreated course of syphilis in black men without informed consent and withheld treatment when penicillin became available. This study caused needless suffering and deaths and reshaped research ethics. Nazi human experiments and wartime abuses, 1930s, 1940s, extreme state-sponsored medical atrocities performed on prisoners of concentration camps, later prosecuted at Nuremberg, and foundational to modern research ethics. Mid-20th century, pesticides, persistent chemicals, and ecology DDT widespread use and environmental collapse, 1940s, 1970s. DDT's use in agriculture and mosquito control led to bioaccumulation, disastrous impacts on birds and wildlife, and eventual regulatory bans, controls in many countries. PCBs, industrial chlorinated compounds, mid-1900s, persistent organic pollutants contaminated food chains and caused long-term human and ecological harm. Agent Orange, Vietnam War, 1960s, 1970s, large-scale herbicide defoliant use containing dioxin, TCDD, produced severe ecological damage and long-term health problems, cancers, birth defects, for Vietnamese people and veterans. 1950s, 1960s, drugs and deformities, thalidomide, 1950s, 1960s, marketed as a sedative and for morning sickness, thalidomide caused thousands of severe birth defects, limb malformations, before regulators in some countries banned it. A landmark disaster that changed drug approval processes. Cold War era, radiation, secret experiments, and nuclear testing. Radiation experiments and secret human exposures, 1940s, 1970s, governments conducted tests exposing soldiers, patients, and prisoners to radiation and radioactive materials without informed consent. Atmospheric and underwater nuclear testing, 1940s, 1960s, tests exposed nearby populations, e.g. Pacific Islands, Nevada, and environments to fallout, causing displacement, long-term contamination, and health harms, Marshall Islands, Rongelap, etc. Chernobyl nuclear accident, 1986. Catastrophic reactor accident caused large-scale evacuation, environmental contamination, and long-term health impacts and displacement. Late 20th century, corporate medicine, industrial toxins, and more, asbestos litigation, and recognized occupational disease. Millions exposed over decades, later linked to fatal cancers. Mesothelioma. WHO, ILO reporting. Rise of plastics and petrochemical pollution, post-1950s onward, exponential plastic production created persistent pollution pathways. Opioid marketing and epidemic, 1990s, 2020s. Aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, notably OxyContin's launch and promotion, and overprescribing contributed to widespread addiction and overdose deaths. This is a major modern public health disaster tied to corporate behavior and medical practice. 21st century, global pollution, biodiversity loss, and persistent contaminants. Microplastics and plastic pollution, 2000s present. Plastics fragment into microplastics that enter food chains, oceans, and the atmosphere. Effects on wildlife and human health are an ongoing global concern. Neonicotinoid insecticides and pollinator declines. Certain systemic pesticides contributed to bee and pollinator declines, threatening food production and ecosystems. Chemical contamination and legacy wastes. Sites contaminated with PCBs, PFAS, forever chemicals, and other persistent industrial chemicals create chronic exposures for communities and wildlife. Patterns and categories. How harm repeats. 1. Unconsenting or vulnerable subjects. Prisoners, colonial indigenous populations, institutionalized people, wartime prisoners, and economically disadvantaged groups were repeatedly used in experiments or exposed without their informed consent. Tuskegee, MKUltra, sterilizations, radiation tests. 2. Regulatory lag and corporate profit. Slow regulation and aggressive corporate marketing, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, allowed dangerous products to be widely adopted before harms were understood. DDT, thalidomide, opioids. 3. Persistent, long-tail environmental damage. Some harms, PCBs, DDT, PFAS, nuclear fallout, microplastics, persist for decades or centuries and affect food chains and future generations. 4. Species and ecosystem loss. Pesticides, habitat conversion, plastics, and pollution have contributed to insect declines, bees, bird population collapses, marine mammal deaths, and broader biodiversity loss. 5. Policy and ethics reform often follow disaster. Major scandals, diasters, Nazi medical experiments, Nuremberg Code, Tuskegee, research ethics reform, thalidomide, stronger drug approval rules, prompted safety and ethics safeguards, but usually after large human-animal cost. Representative deaths, populations, and groups affected. Non-exhaustive, direct human victims. Research subjects, Tuskegee men, involuntary radiation subjects, patients harmed by unsafe drugs or surgeries, thalidomide victims, lobotomy patients, communities near industrial sites or test ranges, Marshall Islands, Chernobyl evacuees, people affected by epidemics driven by inappropriate medical practice, opioid overdose victims. Animal victims, laboratory animals, millions yearly in basic and applied research. Wildlife killed by pesticides or entangled in plastics, birds, turtles, fish. Pollinators harmed by systemic insecticides. Ecosystems, coral reefs, coastal fisheries, and agricultural soils damaged by chemical runoff, oil and plastic pollution, nuclear contamination, and large-scale herbicide use. Agent Orange. Sources and further reading. Select reliable summaries. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. CDC Overview and Timeline. Thalidomide History and Consequences. Peer-reviewed historical review. DDT History and EPA Cancellation, 1972, EPA Summary. Origins and Role of OxyContin, Opioid Crisis, Public Health Analyses, CDC Peer Literature. Microplastics and Global Plastic Legacy, UNEP Reporting and Overviews. Chernobyl and Fukushima, IAEA and WHO Assessments of Accidents and Impacts. Agent Orange, TARN, Dioxin Effects, VA and Scientific Journalism Summaries.